Stormbringer Enhancement Shaman is still looking to be the default pick for M+. In Season 3, it gets a very prominent tier set that procs Ascendance, along with a Thorum's change to make Windstrike use Tempest automatically in AoE. This will be a fully M+ focused guide, although it will have some references to single target. I recommend using this talent build, which is the same as last season's. There are a few talents that I do think can be swapped. I will go over this later in the video. Now for the basics, Enhance is a spec where you build and spend, and your builders all have a cooldown. Stormstrike is your most prominent builder that you will be spamming a lot. Crash Lightning is an AoE builder that is essentially used off CD and AoE, and then you have Lava Lash and Voltaic Blaze that are mostly just used to spread Flame Shock. These builders build a random amount of Maelstrom weapon, which you want to spend when you are on 10 stacks, but it is also fine to spend on 8 or 9 stacks, or even 5 if all of your builders are on cooldown. Never spend at under 5 stacks. On single target, choose Lightning Bolt as your spender, and on AoE, choose Chain Lightning. When you add Tempest into the mix, it's a little more complicated. A simple rule is to always spend with Tempest if you have it. Now for what Tempest is, it is a replacement to Lightning Bolt that does high damage and splashes in an AoE, and also amplifies your future damage. You gain Tempest when you have spent 40 stacks of Maelstrom or procced Awakening Storms 4 times. Now these things are not tracked in the native Blizzard UI, so here is a mandatory weak aura from Nick U that you need to play this spec. Now the strength of Tempest is in the Rolling Thunder talent that summons a Lightning Dog for 15 seconds on every Tempest. This is a stacking multiplicative damage buff to all of your damage by 10%. So in a situation where you use Tempest many times in succession, it creates what is essentially a cooldown window. In this representation here, 3 Tempests are pressed in a 5-second window, creating a 10-second period of 33% increased damage. If you then get another Tempest and use it in that window, not only is that Tempest benefiting from the 33% damage, but then you have a 5-second period of 46% increased damage after that. With Ascendance and the new tier set, this can get up to 8 Tempests, which would give you 114% increased damage. So a lot of your burst potential comes from having multiple Tempests close to each other. But in your normal rotation, you will typically achieve this naturally and just spend Tempest whenever you can. This is the general priority list. You are looking to spend at 10 with the correct spender, and then use your builders in the order Stormstrike over Voltaic Blaze over Lava Lash. In AoE, you press Crash Lightning above those, but in single target, it is the very bottom after losing the Season 2 tier set. Now, Enhancement Shaman has 3 important cooldowns: Primordial Wave, Doom Winds, and Ascendance. Primordial Wave is actually the strongest cooldown Enhance has. It is a 30-second cooldown that on AoE gives you 30% haste and an 8-second period of your spenders doing about 48% more damage, which is concentrated into lightning rods. To use Primordial Wave, you have to first spread Flame Shock with Lava Lash or Voltaic Blaze. After using Primordial Wave, it will turn into Primordial Storm, which is a spender you must use in the next 15 seconds that is far stronger than all of your other spenders. Because Primordial Storm is considered an attack, it gives Maelstrom weapon and procs Wind Fury. Using Primordial Storm during Doom Winds is ideal, however you can't always fit it in. To talk about what Doom Winds is, it is a very brief 8-second duration buff on a 1-minute cooldown. It essentially amplifies the Maelstrom gain from all of your attacks. This is useful to use right before Ascendance because you can run low on Maelstrom sometimes during Ascendance. After that, use it directly 1 minute apart to try to keep Doom Winds and Ascendance synced. Ascendance is the big 2-minute enhanced cooldown. It replaces Stormstrike with Windstrike, which builds and spends in the same global. It is very efficient to press. In Season 3, they updated the way Windstrike works. You used to have to manually press Tempest in Ascendance, but now you can just spam Windstrike and it will automatically use Tempest. So the Ascendance rotation is very simplified. On single target, it will look like this. Press Primordial Wave into Doom Winds into Ascendance to set up, and then spam Windstrike. At some point, you will not have any Tempest left, and you should be close to 10 Maelstrom, and then you will use Primordial Storm. Sometimes you will be unlucky and won't reach 10 Maelstrom, and will have to send Primordial Storm on 5 or so Maelstrom before it expires. But apart from this Primordial Storm, every other global and single target Ascendance is Windstrike. And in AoE, it is actually much the same. Press Windstrike every global except for Primordial Storm. You can press Crash Lightning during Ascendance under the condition that you are below 5 Maelstrom though. Now they have removed Prestacking, so in the first pool of a dungeon we have no Tempests, or maybe just any other pool where you have no Tempest going into it. We probably want to build the Tempest counter a little bit before we pop CDs. So an actual AOE opener would have us Flame Shock, then Crash Lightning and Lava Lash to spread, and then press some combination of Chain Lightning into Stormstrike and other builders, Chain Lightning again, and all of this is so that we do not go into a naked Ascendance with no progress towards Tempest. Now this is a sample opener. I'm going to walk into the pool. I'm not going to be too worried about like Flame Shock spreading yet. I'm not going to be too worried about opening my cooldowns because while the pool is gathering, I'm just sitting here pressing Chain Lightning and builders to build up some Tempest. Now I go into my cooldowns, I press Primordial Wave, Doom Winds, Ascendance, and I'm just spamming Windstrike here. And you can see I'm just spamming Windstrike. I'm going to press Crash Lightning here, and then a Primordial Storm, and that's a 10 Maelstrom Primordial Storm because I pressed the Crash Lightning. And here I got a lucky tier proc, which gave me 2 extra Tempest, so I'm just sitting on 7, 8 dogs here, and I am doing quite a bit of damage. Now, the Season 3 tier set is very big and very overarching. The 2 set grants you a proc of Ascendance every time you reach 8 Awakening Storm procs. These come from Spenders and Stormstrike, and it's kind of random but deterministic at the same time. And it gives you a charge of Tempest every time you enter this Ascendance, or every time you press the cooldown Ascendance, or every time you proc Deeply Rooted Elements. And do not bother looking at the 4 set, it is an entirely passive damage increase. And Blizzard forgot again to put this in the base UI, so we need a second mandatory weak aura now to track this tier set. So how do we play around this tier? The simple answer is that when it procs, you can just spam Windstrike for the duration of the proc. However, there are some ways you can influence this tier so that it procs at an opportune time. Now, a complication is that when you proc this Ascendance, it gives you 2 Tempests, one from the 2 set and one from Awakening. And this is a good thing, but because the maximum stacks of Tempest is 2, you will lose any pre-existing stacks of Tempest that you were holding. So you have to play in a way that if you are close to proccing tier, you are very liberal with your Tempest usage and aim to not hold on to any as the tier is proccing. This also means that you have to use Tempest before you press Ascendance if you are on 2 stacks. So we can play around it a little bit by doing this. If you are mid-pull, your tier set is at 7 stacks ready to proc, you have a Tempest and no Maelstrom. Ignore Stormstrike. Use your smaller builders like Lava Lash or Voltaic Blaze to build to 5, and then send a Tempest on 5. Hopefully this will proc tier, allowing you to snowball a bit. But then if we don't proc tier here, we get to the point where we have Tempest and 7 stacks again, but we can only build with Stormstrike. Then we just press Stormstrike, and if tier procs and munches some of the Tempest, we are just a bit sad. So here is just a typical tier set proc. Nothing too special here. I go to 7, I proc the tier, and I'm just pressing Windstrike through this whole tier. And after this tier, I press Primordial Storm. There's a pretty big boost to it. And now here is the awkward thing. We always want to have a tier proc at the start of a pull if possible, which allows us to build up a lot of momentum. And especially if we're pressing Ascendance on that pull, having Ascendance into 2 free Tempests of a tier proc is actually quite insane. But the issue is getting that proc at the start of the pull. So if you're at the end of a pull, you're close to a proc, mobs are close to dying, it would be a complete waste to use a tier proc, as they take up to a minute to build sometimes. So if you're at the end of a pull and you see your tier stacks at 7, then we must immediately stop using any Spenders or Stormstrike entirely. We can press our weak builders for a tiny bit of damage, and then we go AFK completely. Just sit there and auto attack a mob. So here's an example of this AFK thing I'm talking about. I was at 6, I just went to 7. The mob's health is actually a bit high, so I'm risking it. I'm pressing like Chain Lightning, I press a Stormstrike. But now there's no way I want to proc here. The next pull is a last pull coming up. I really want to save this proc. So I'm pressing Crash Lightning, I press a Lava Lash, and now I'm just sitting here auto-attacking these mobs. And I can't do anything, otherwise I'll waste my proc on mobs that have 20 million health left. Now, if you played Stormbringer in past seasons, you will know how important Tempest pulling at the end of a pull is, but tier pulling is a bit more important, so it does take precedence. A lot of the time, you will lose Tempest stacks because you don't want to proc tier. But the Tempest pulling is still relevant. So here is a slide from my last season guide. Essentially, you would want to end a pull with 30 or so progress towards Tempest so that you would get a Tempest early in the pull. And to take it a step further and be optimal, you would leave a pull with 2 Tempests already procced. So this is something to keep in mind. If your tier is at low stacks at the end of a pull, say you end a pull on 4 stacks, you can start saving up Tempests. And to do this, you just press Chain Lightning instead of Tempest, even on one mob if it is close to death. But keep in mind, tier takes priority. So if you're at 7 stacks of tier, just drop all of this and prioritize the tier over the Tempests. And here's something extra about pulling while you are mid-pull and not leaving the pull anytime soon. You typically want to start with 2 Tempests before you even enter Ascendance. This will amplify your entire Ascendance by 21%. So when we are 20 seconds off Ascendance, you want to start building up Tempests. Use Chain Lightning instead of Tempest if Ascendance cooldown is less than 20, even on single target. Make sure to use 1 Tempest before entering Ascendance. And of course, if you would overcap Tempest while doing this, simply use 1. And if your tier is at 7 stacks, simply ignore all of this and just use a Tempest so that it does not proc and munch them. Now, this whole tier set Tempest thing might be a bit confusing and it might be a bit frustrating because there are times where you legitimately cannot control it and you just lose Tempest because your tier procs at the wrong time. Or there are times that you want your tier to proc and it just doesn't proc because it is inherently random. So it is much of an intuition thing, it is something that you would get used to. Now to talk about some other things that you might have questions about. cooldown usage, you do want to sync everything together. Primordial Wave and Ascendance are very important to be used together. Sometimes while going pack to pack, you will start to delay Primordial Wave, and Primordial Wave and Ascendance will be desynced. Sometimes you will hold Primordial Wave for Ascendance, but it is very important that if Ascendance comes up and Primordial Wave is on cooldown, then you hold Ascendance for Primordial Wave, unless there is a very important timing to be made and you can't hold Ascendance. Doom Winds is less important. You don't have to wait for it. It is simply ideal to have it sync up with Ascendance. Now, Prestacking was a plague in the last 2 seasons. Everyone hated Shamans because of it, and they have finally fixed it. There is no way to smuggle Tempest into a key now. I did make a video of a way earlier in PTR, and they fixed it. I'm very happy about that. There is one thing you can do pre-key though, and that is use Ascendance on the pull timer to start the key with 10 Maelstrom. Nothing major. Arc Discharge is essentially a passive increase to some Chain Lightnings. You don't really play around it. I recommend ignoring it. There is a portion of it that makes your Chain Lightning instant. That is only relevant for Ellie. As Enhanced, you never press an instant Arc Discharge spender because the damage is too low. There is one use of Arc Discharge though, and that is an Arc Discharge Chain Lightning will refresh the duration of any existing Tempest. Do not ask why. So if you have 2 Tempests walk into a pack and they are about to expire, you can hardcast a Tempest and queue an instant Chain Lightning to refresh the second stack. Lightning Rod has been auto-spreading on Chain Lightning since Season 2 and is now essentially a passive damage increase on spenders. Just know that your Primordial Wave causes a window where you do a lot of Lightning Rod damage and ignore it otherwise. Flame Shock is a semi-important dot, mostly for its interaction with Primordial Wave. Outside of that, it doesn't matter. In the normal rotation, you will typically rarely go 20 seconds without refreshing Flame Shock, so you don't have to think about it too much, but sometimes you can have it fall off, so make sure you always refresh Flame Shocks before Primordial Wave. In Ascendance, we ignore Flame Shock completely. Do not think about it at all. And in single target, we also kind of ignore Flame Shock. You only really want to reapply it with Voltaic Blaze. Now some talent options this season. Converging Storms is weaker than last season, so we can opt to take Ice Strike or Sundering with that point. And if we take Sundering, we can also drop Flurry for Ice Strike. I like these 2 spells because there is a lot of time where you do not want to press Storm Strike to manipulate tier, and Ice Strike is good there. Also, Sundering is just a nice stop to have. These talents don't really add much damage though, and using the passive options is completely fine, maybe even better in some scenarios. And then there's Deeply Rooted Elements. With a Season 3 tier, Deeply Rooted Elements benefits twice as much as Ascendance. You gain 1 Tempest and 2 Stormslice stacks every time you proc Dre, meaning the damage potential is higher, and this is reflected in the sims as well. But the issue is practicality. Here is a gambit where I played Dre and procced at very inopportune times on the first 2 pulls, causing me to be doing tank damage 3 minutes into the dungeon. I ended this key with fine overall though. Dre is not completely random. It has been discovered that it works on a deck of cards, so every 333 Maelstrom spent is guaranteed to give 2 Dre procs, no more, no less. So the variance is not as high as you think. It only matters when you proc, not how much you proc. I won't comment on gear because I think it's a bit of an uncertainty right now. For stats, you will go Haste Mastery, but we have so many stats now that crit and verse are also fine. I recommend just simming things. This will be the end of the guide, but I will say, as of the start of this tier, Enhanced tuning in the raid is not great, so that is why this is an M+ guide. But I do think Enhanced is actually kind of looking good in M+. Some tier lists are placing it low, but I have played it a lot on PTR, and I think it's actually kind of good.